Joining me now, Simon Rosenberg, who's president and founder of NDN. He's also a former campaign advisor to President Clinton. And Mark Thiessen, who's a fellow at the American Enterprise Institute and a former speechwriter for President George W. Bush. All right, so there you have Ben LaBolt, who's the campaign spokesperson, Simon, coming out and saying expressly that the president believes it's a penalty. He disagrees with the Supreme Court that it's a tax and suggesting that they never referred to it as a tax. Now, look, I want to show you what the president's lawyer argued to the U.S. Supreme Court. It's not like Chief Justice Roberts pulled this out of his ear. This is the president's lawyer in front of the Supreme Court. Okay, ready? Follow me on this. Justices, it is a tax law fully integrated into the tax system that triggers tax consequences for noncompliance. The law imposes a tax liability and tax penalties on non-exempted individuals. The penalty operates to increase the taxpayer's total tax liability and is valid not only as a tax in its own right, but also as an adjunct to the income tax. Simon, this is the president, through his lawyer, telling the Supreme Court it is valid as a tax. So are they being straight with the American people and now sending Ben LaBolt, among others, to come out and say it's not a tax?
Well, let's look at what the architect of this strategy said about this, Mitt Romney.
Before you go to Romney, let's stay on President Obama. We'll get to Mitt Romney.
I'm going to.
But answer my question
Mitt Romney called it a tax penalty. Mitt Romney has called it a tax penalty.
Mitt Romney was not the architect of Obamacare. He wasn't. He was the architect of Romney
Care. Of the individual mandate. And
let's stay on point. We'll get to Romney in a minute. We're sticking with Barack Obama.
Megan, I'm going to answer your question. The point is that it is a penalty under the tax authority. That's what the Supreme Court said, right, is that they can use it legally under taxing authority. And let's just be clear about what this does.
Wait a minute.
Because we've seen it implemented. Why can't I answer the question, Megan?
Because you're not being direct either. Yes, they argued he had the power under the taxing clause, powers of the Constitution. But I just showed it to you. Then they went into the Supreme Court, Simon, and said it is valid as a tax in its own right.
But can I explain how it works? Can I explain how it works and you decide? I'll let the viewers decide.
I want you to respond to the words. The words
I think
that made to the Supreme Court.
I think it's a penalty. I'm answering your question. I think it's a penalty and not a tax.
All right, let me give it to you, Mark, because look, we'll help them again. Viewers can look at this for themselves, okay? Here's what bothers me about this, Mark, is you can argue that, you know, it is one or it isn't one, and it's a good tax, and it's not a tax. But let's just be straight about it. You can't say to the American people one thing and then say something else to the Supreme Court and then come out and pretend you never said that to the Supreme Court. It's a matter of judicial record.
You know, it's this law of the land. Look, I'm going to read you something from the Supreme Court's decision because they actually explicitly rejected the argument that it was a penalty. They accepted the argument that you quoted from the Solicitor General, and then they said that the funds due or referred to as a penalty does not alter their essential character as taxes. They went on to say if the concept of a penalty means anything, it means punishment for an unlawful act or admission, and since failure to have health insurance is not unlawful, therefore it is, quote, a tax on those who do not have health insurance, unquote. That is the decision of the Supreme Court upholding Obamacare. So the president can't have it both ways. He can't argue in the Supreme Court that it is a tax and then try and argue in the court of public opinion that it's not. If he doesn't believe it was a tax, then why did he authorize his Solicitor General to argue in front of the Supreme Court that it was? Did he lie?
His lawyer went in and said it is valid as a tax. He didn't just say under the taxing power. He said it is valid as a tax. And then, the Supreme Court, the Chief Justice, Simon, John Roberts, whose vote was critical, then asked him, well, then why didn't you just say it was a tax when you were passing it? In other words, why didn't you tell the American people it was a tax and listen to what the president's lawyer said as a justification?
Sure.
Why didn't Congress call it a tax then? Well, you're telling me they thought of it as a tax, they defended it on the tax power. Why didn't they say it was a tax?
They might have thought, Your Honor, that calling it as they did would make it more effective in accomplishing its objectives, but it is in the Internal Revenue Code. It is collected by the IRS on April 15th.
More effective in accomplishing its objective, which is to get it passed, to get the American people to approve it, Simon.
Let's just be clear about what it does, right? In Massachusetts, where this has been implemented, it's affected 1% of all of the adults in the state. This is not some broad-based tax. No, but this is not some broad-based tax This is not a sales tax. This is not an income tax. It's only going to affect 1% of the people of the United States, people who do not already have health insurance and can afford it. So if you have health insurance and you're watching this show, you don't have to worry about anything. If you have Medicare and you're watching the show, you don't have to worry about anything. It's going to affect a very small number of people.
But now you're arguing whether it's a good tax, and that's fine. It may be.
No,
it may be. But the question is the language, and whether it is a tax or it isn't, and whether the president is being straight on this.
In the state in which this was implemented, they called it a penalty. And Mitt Romney has called it a penalty the entire time that he was governor and when he was running for president up until a few days ago.
Well, let's talk about that, Mark, because as a political matter, all right, so what the politicians are saying about it is one thing. Mitt Romney's been all over the board on this as well, all right? So his top campaign guy, Eric Fernstrom, comes out earlier and says, what we did in Massachusetts, well, that's a penalty. And then Mitt Romney came out today, and he said this.
I said that I agreed with the dissent. And the dissent made it very clear that they felt it was unconstitutional. But the dissent lost. It's in the minority. And so now the Supreme Court has spoken. And while I agreed with the dissent, that's taken over by the fact that the majority of the court said it's a tax, and therefore it is a tax.
So is he in a position now, given what happened in Massachusetts and given what Eric Fernstrom said, to come out and try to argue to the American public that it's a tax, not a penalty?
Yeah. Well, Simon obviously needs to read the opinion a little more carefully, because what the opinion says is that the states have the power to regulate individual conduct in a way that the federal government doesn't. So actually, technically, in Massachusetts, it is an individual mandate, which is constitutional, but under federal law, it's a tax. So Romney's technically correct, but look, he screwed this up. His campaign shouldn't have said what they said initially. But here's the thing that bothers me. We're talking about whether Mitt Romney's all over the map on this. Look at Barack Obama. He argued before the U.S. Congress it wasn't a tax. He argued before the Supreme Court it was a tax, and now he's arguing before the American people that it isn't a tax. That's not a flip-flop. That's a triple axle. I mean, if anybody's been inconsistent, it's been Barack Obama.
A triple taxle.
Triple taxle. I like that.
Thanks, guys. I got to go.
Good.
I had thought
Thanks,
of that.
Megan.
Pleasure, as always.
Thank you.
We're taking your thoughts on that.